21st of December, 1943, 7 o'clock in the morning, there's a huge explosion, absolutely humongous explosion. They have destroyed the Cattedrale San Tommaso, the San Tommaso Cathedral. Probably one of the most revered buildings in Ortona. It's the tomb of St. Thomas. And it looks like a big cleaver has come down and just cut the building in half. The 21st of December is the anniversary of the Feast of St. Thomas, and the civilians that inhabit Ortona usually spend the 21st of December having a large celebration. The Germans have, ironically, on this anniversary, they've destroyed the Cattedrale.
This is Peter Stursberg of the CBC reporting from the Italian front.
I am speaking from an observation post near the Moro River. This OP is in the old wall of a little old town on the Adriatic. It is 25 minutes past 3. 5 minutes from now...
It's 26 minutes past 3, Matt.
What? Okay, thanks, Gordon. It's 26 minutes past 3, it seems. 4 minutes from now, there'll be a tremendous artillery barrage laid down on the enemy positions across the Moro River from here. The barrage will continue intermittently for an hour or so, and at 4:30, our infantry, I can't say which infantry, I'm sorry, will move across the valley, across the little river and up the other side of the valley to attack the enemy positions. For a long time today, we have watched battle enough. It's quiet now, but I think you'll hear it. It's incredible that one is here watching a battle, and that one should have such a dramatic view of a battle. And on such a gorgeous day, with a warm sun, and the Adriatic dancing in the light. War on such a day seems particularly tragic and unreal. Even when the enemy shells hit right on top of this OP, as they do sometimes. You'll probably hear some. It's so beautiful, I mean the view from here. The other side of the valley is an enchanting patchwork of vivid reds, greens, and yellows, like daubs of paint, like a painting by Cézanne. But the enemy is waiting there, only 2,000 to 3,000 yards away. But now I'll take the microphone outside, because it's almost 3:30.
Days before Christmas in 1943, Canadian soldiers were tasked with regaining contact with German forces inside the city of Ortona, an idyllic Italian resort town along the eastern Adriatic coast. The fight for Ortona was the most significant urban fight of the Mediterranean campaign, holding a place of honor in the pantheon of Canadian military history. In September 1943, the Allies began their assault on the Italian mainland. The British landings, codenamed Operation Baytown, seized the ports of Reggio and San Giovanni. On the 9th of September, the U.S.-led Operation Avalanche attempted to seize the port of Naples, while the British 1st Airborne Division's Operation Slapstick seized the ports of Taranto and Brindisi on the heel of the Italian boot. After some nervous moments during the Salerno landings, the Allies consolidated their positions and began to push out from their beachheads. Between 18 September and 30 November, the Allies methodically advanced over 600 kilometers, overcoming the Italian terrain, nature, and a spirited German defense. Toward the end of November, the British 8th Army was positioned just south of the Sangro River. Montgomery's intention was for the 8th Army to attack north, create multiple penetrations of the German Bernard and Gustav lines, and continue to the city of Pescara to seize control of the east-west highway to Rome. This would relieve the pressure on the U.S. 5th Army in the west, forcing the German units in its sector to either displace north or risk being cut off. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division, under the command of Major General Christopher Vokes, moved into the easternmost position near where the Canadians were about to become the main effort in this renewed offensive. Their immediate objectives would be to cross the Moro River, seize the high ground and a deep ravine on the opposite bank, which the Canadians would refer to as the Gully. Once these were secured, They would continue to the seaside town of Ortona, a necessary step on the road to Pescara.
Whenever I'm discussing this battle, I talk about the geographic factors, which are often overlooked when it comes to not only the Battle of Ortona, but urban warfare battles in general. So at the strategic level, you have, throughout Italy, are the Apennine Mountains, which are right down the center of Italy itself, right down the center of the boot. The reason why the Apennine Mountains are important is because the Germans use that to their advantage in Italy, because what they're able to do is they're able to add man-made obstacles to the natural obstacles that these valleys present. And so the Germans make a series of defensive lines throughout southern Italy to grind away and attrit and weaken the Allies as they're moving up the Italian boot. The most important defensive line is the Gustav line. It cuts right across the entirety of the country. Adolf Hitler tells Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Smiling Albert, because he always, whenever you look at a photo of him, he's always got this big smile on his face. So he tells Smiling Albert, the Gustav line is where you're going to stop the Allies, period, full stop, because they cannot take Rome. Throughout the Sicily and the Italian campaigns, the Germans would always hold in an urban area for 24 to 48 hours. They would inflict some losses, and then they would withdraw back to the natural obstacle that had been created by the deep valleys. And so they did this all the way up the Italian boot. So British 8th Army makes the natural assumption at Ortona that the Germans are going to hold it for 24 to 40 hours, and then they're going to pull back to the Arieli River, and that's where the Gustav line is. The way that Ortona is laid out geographically, it has a big influence on how this battle is fought. Ortona is a defender's dream, because not only do you have this very dense urban terrain sitting on top of a plateau, you have a ravine to the very west of the city where the houses literally crawl right to the edge of the ravine. And that ravine can be anywhere from 50 to 75 meters in depth, and it's straight up. On the east side of the city, you have a large cliff. And once again, the houses go right up to the edge of the cliff. And this cliff is on average about 75 meters in depth. And then you have the Adriatic Sea just off to the east of that. And then to the south, you have a gentle rolling plain that rolls up into Ortona itself. So this is a defender's dream, because not only do the German paratroopers have a dense urban area of which to defend from, but because it sits on a plateau, the Canadians can't come in from the east or the west, because there's the large ravine to the west, there's the large cliffs in the Adriatic Sea to the east, and so they can't flank the town. So you have to come up from the south and enter this town in order to gain lodgment and start fighting into the town itself. And it's split into two very easily recognizable sections. So you have Newtown, which is the southern half of Ortona, where the buildings are larger and they're separated, and so there's spaces in between the buildings. The top northern half of Ortona is Old Town, and what they've done there is the buildings literally stand shoulder to shoulder, with very few or no space in between the buildings themselves. And then sprinkled throughout the city are a number of piazzae, a number of squares, which as Germans have turned into kill zones. And we're so focused on the battle, the trigger pulling part, that we have to remember that before the battle and after the battle, there were events that happened too. Throughout urban warfare history, there are always civilians on the urban battlefield. You usually have about 10% of the civilians of an urban area will actually stay in the urban area. They won't leave. At the tactical level, the German Wehrmacht, the regular army units, they've actually been in Ortona since September of 1943. They've told all the families, you must leave the town within 72 hours, or else if you're here, we're going to assume that you're spies and that we'll execute you for being a spy. So despite this warning, out of the 10,000 civilians that inhabit Ortona, 1,000 of them still stay inside the town itself, and they hide in their basements. And all they're hoping for is that this violent urban storm will eventually pass by them. The Germans, their tactical plan for Ortona is to rubble all of the buildings on the secondary streets of the town is by rubbling all those streets, it prevents the Canadians from being able to advance up the secondary streets and come in from the flanks to try to do flanking attacks on the defense positions. After they've done the rubbling, they place landmines and booby traps and improvised explosive devices in all the rubble. There's 5 large squares in Ortona. So they put all their defensive positions around the piazza. And so they do several months of this planning.
After weeks of intense fighting for the gully, the 1st Brigade of the Canadian 1st Infantry Division conducted a rearward passage of lines, handing the coming fight for Ortona over to the division's 2nd Brigade under the command of Brigadier Bertram Merrill Hoffmeister. The brigade had 3 organic battalions: the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, and the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. This was a true combined arms organization with artillery and engineers and a tank and armor support from the tankers of the Three Rivers Regiment.
So what the Germans intend to do is they're going to have a perimeter force battle at the very southern edge of the town. This is where they're going to entice the Canadians in. And then because they've destroyed all the secondary streets, they've left Highway 16, which is the 1st Canadian Infantry Division's main logistical route. It's nice and wide, and they've left it open. Right? So perimeter force battle at the south to entice the Canadians in, and then suck the Canadians up Highway 16, up that clear road, into the heart of the town, and then where all the piazzae are, where all the squares are, that's where they're going to destroy the Canadians. And that German scheme of maneuver will allow them to stop the Canadians as part of the overall defensive plan of the Gustav Line. There's 5 squares in Ortona. The very southernmost square is the Piazza Vittoria. And that Piazza Vittoria really divides Old Town from New Town. And then up in the northern end of the town, there's 4 squares: Piazza San Francesco in the west, Piazza Municipale, Piazza Plebiscita, and to the northeast, Piazza San Tommaso. And these 4 squares, this is the main defensive area. This is where the Germans are bound and determined to stop the Canadians from advancing any further north. According to British 8th Army intelligence, the Germans are going to stay in Ortona for 24 to 48 hours. So you're going to have to go up there, give them a bloody nose. Then they're going to withdraw back to the Arieli River, and then we've got the big fight at the Gustav Line up the Arieli River. That's why the Canadians only initially throw a battalion into this particular fight. There's a troop of tanks. In the American doctrine, you call it a platoon of tanks, but in Canadian doctrine, it's a troop of tanks, so 4 tanks, that are on the road itself, and they are creeping their way up to the southern edge of the city. There's this huge explosion, and the troop commander's tank, Lieutenant Melvin, his tank is destroyed by a very large anti-tank minefield. They had piled the anti-tank mines on top of each other, and Lieutenant Melvin drove his tank over. Ended up actually blowing the tank up into the air and flipping it over and landing it on its top. Kills all 5 of the soldiers inside, including Lieutenant Melvin. At that point, the Germans start engaging the Loyal Edmonton Regiment soldiers. D Company on the left is having a real tough time of it. In fact, the company commander, Major Jim Stone, and he's referred to as Big Jim Stone, because he was very physically imposing. He was a very stocky gentleman. He was very tall. He was over 6 feet tall. And he was also very short-tempered. So Big Jim Stone is having real challenges. He's tried 2 attacks to get his company into the edge of Ortona on the left side of the highway, but his troops keep getting cut down. He starts off with like 90 soldiers. By the time he's finished his second attack, he's down to 30 soldiers. And one of his platoon commanders, James Dugan, says, "Sir, I got an idea. There seems to be a little ditch off to the left of us here to the west side. I'm going to take I'll take my platoon up the ditch, and I'm going to infiltrate in behind the German position, because the Germans were in front of a pensione." So James Dugan does that. Lieutenant Dugan, he takes his platoon up, and he's able to sneak into the pensione and go up to the 2nd floor, and he's able to stick his weapons out the 2nd floor and see the Germans below, and they open fire and they destroy those German positions. That allows the Loyal Edmonton Regiment now to send that battalion up and break in and gain lodgment at the southern side of Ortona on the west side of the highway. 21st of December, 1943, 7 o'clock in the morning, there's a huge explosion. Absolutely humongous explosion. And what the Germans have done on the north end of the town is they have destroyed the Cattedrale San Tommaso, the San Tommaso Cathedral. The cathedral itself it looks like a big cleaver has come down and just cut the building in half. And all of the rubble is now spilled out into the Piazza San Tommaso. And this all goes again to the German plan of rubbling, major buildings to make it hard for the Canadians to advance through Ortona itself.
On the eastern Adriatic side, Lieutenant Colonel Sid Thompson, commander of the Seaforth Highlanders, had D Company set in a support by fire, while C Company assaulted 4 German crew-served weapons positions. The Canadians successfully used a creeping barrage to suppress or destroy the German positions, while the assault company destroyed the remnants.
Originally, their goal that day was to get into a large church at the southeast corner of Ortona. It's the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople. But the Seaforths fall about 300 meters short of reaching their objective by the end of the day. But at least the Loyal Eddies now, they're at the south end of the town. They've broken in and gained lodgment.
While Lieutenant Colonel Jefferson's Loyal Eddies advanced north along Highway 16, the Seaforths continued their movement north, with D Company to the west, maintaining contact with the Eddies, and C Company in the east along the Adriatic coastline.
This is where the 90th Anti-Tank Battery comes into play. So the battery's commander was Major Tiger Welsh, and what he thought was, well, you know what? It's a German parachute division, so they don't have tanks. But I've got these 6-pounder and 17-pounder anti-tank guns here, sitting here doing nothing. I might as well get them into the fight. So what he does is he brings up his 6-pounder anti-tank guns, and his soldiers start firing anti-tank rounds at all the rubble piles. And they start blowing all the rubble piles down, and at the same time detonating all the landmines and booby traps and improvised explosive devices that are in the landmines. And this way the tanks can come up, and now they can see over the rubble piles, because these rubble piles are like 15, 20 feet high. And now the tanks can actually see over the rubble piles, and now they can start firing at German positions that are down the street.
Struggle as tank after tank plunges forward yard by yard through rubble infested with mines and booby traps.
All right, so you have this very innovative use of these anti-tank guns. Once again, this great combined arms usage of infantry, engineers, tanks, and now artillery guns being used for the fight, which is really good. And they're clearing the buildings by going in through the doors and windows on the ground floor and fighting up. They don't really have a choice because remember, this is Newtown where all the buildings are separated and there's space in between them. So they have to go in through the doors and the windows and fight up. And the challenge, of course, is that the Germans have booby-trapped the doors and the windows. The Germans know that the Canadians have to come in through the doors and windows, so they've set up machine gun positions and riflemen to, as soon as the Canadians walk in through the door and windows, they're going to get shot. Right? But this is the type of fighting they have to do because, the urban geography doesn't allow for them to do it any other way. Seaforth Highlanders of Canada on the southeast corner, they've now advanced far enough where they get into the southeast corner of Ortona, and they're actually able to get into the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople, where there's several hours of fighting in this sizable church. And unfortunately, they end up destroying most of the interior of the church because of the close quarter combat that's occurring.
By the evening of the 21st, the Eddies have methodically fought their way north to the Piazza Vittoria, and the Seaforths have consolidated their hold on the Santa Maria Constantinople. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson places C Company approximately 300 meters north to provide security, while the rest of the regiment is brought forward to use what is left of the church as a temporary lodgment.
And then he brings the rest of the battalion up to the church itself so that they can stay there for the night because, soldiers aren't going to pass up the opportunity to stay inside a building rather than, dig a trench and put up a tent or anything as such. Buildings are they're a nice luxury. The Canadians immediately learn that the Germans are not going to make their stay in Ortona easy because on the evening of the 21st of December, they start to try to infiltrate German machine gun parties in behind the Canadians. And they also drop artillery down on the Canadians as well. So the Canadians quickly realize, we just can't stop and go to sleep or anything as such. We've got to put out observation posts. We got to stay inside the buildings because the artillery is coming down, etc. And this is going to be the norm every night. At the end of the day, the Canadians stop fighting. They set up their defensive positions, their hasty defense positions, and every night the Germans throw artillery down on them, and then they try to sneak infiltration parties behind the Canadians to try to get in behind the Canadians and cause trouble. That happens every night for the rest of the remainder of the battle. Big Jim Stone, the officer commanding D Company, says to his commanding officer, sir, yesterday we were going into the doors and windows and fighting bottom up. What I want to do after we fight through Piazza Vittoria, what I want to do is when we get to the other side, I don't want to clear the buildings. I just want to advance and I want to bypass all the buildings and try to get up to the north end of the town as quickly as possible. And so Colonel Jefferson says, yeah, you're meeting my intent. So yeah, Big Jim, you can do that.
While tanks from the Three Rivers Regiment and 6-pounder anti-tank guns suppressed German positions from the southern side, combined infantry and sapper teams from the Eddies negotiated the buildings around the piazza, eliminating positions that the suppression had missed. Eventually, they were able to clear the engagement area and set on the northern side.
And this is where Big Jim wants to do what we call a penetration, in that he wants to bypass all the buildings and not clear them. He's now at the northern end of Piazza Vittoria, and this is where Highway 16 is renamed once again, and it becomes the Corso Emanuele. And so Big Jim, he wants to do this rather uniquely. He goes up to the tank commander of the troop of tanks that he has supporting the Loyal Eddies. He's like, when we advance up this street, I want you to blare your horns as loudly as possible. And we're going to have the infantry and the engineers on both sides, and they're going to protect you. But as you advance up the street, just blare your horns really loud, your sirens really loud. So they start the penetration. The Loyal Eddy infantry soldiers, the engineers, they're ahead of the tanks. The tanks are blaring their sirens. And for some reason, as they're advancing up the street, they're not taking any fire at all. Are the Germans, are they flinching or are they scared? Like, what's going on here? What's all this? Or remember, the Germans are trying to suck the Canadians up Highway 16 anyway, so maybe, oh, well, this just gets the Canadians up to our main defensive area even quicker. But the Germans don't react. They start withdrawing through the buildings back up to the Piazza Municipale. And Jim Stone is able to bring his infantry soldiers and Loyal Eddies and the engineers right up to the south end of Piazza Municipale. And then the tank stops suddenly. And Jim Stone is like, what's going on? So he runs up to the tank and he bangs on the tank with his gun, and the tank commander pops his head out of the hatch. And Jim Stone is like, why you stopped? And the tank commander's like, I don't like the look of that piece of sheet metal there. There could be like an anti-tank mine underneath it or something like that. Well, at that point, the Germans realized, hey, the Canadians have stopped moving. And so now they start taking fire from the Piazza Municipale, from the positions up there. And so now they all got to get under cover. The infantry soldiers and the engineers got to get into the buildings now, and they got to start clearing those buildings. The tank commander is somewhat vindicated because at the south end of Piazza Municipale, there's this huge rubble pile. It's like 20 feet high. And there's landmines all around it. And later on in the battle, Jim Stone would go and lift up that piece of sheet metal, and there was no landmine underneath of it. But just a few meters ahead, there are landmines around this huge rubble pile. And Corporal George Campion of the Royal Canadian Engineers, he throws out some smoke grenades, and then he runs up and he starts picking up the landmines and starts throwing them off to the side. And then the smoke dissipates so the Germans can see what he's doing, so they start firing at him. So he throws more smoke grenades out. And the smoke billows up, and then he runs back out there with his engineers, and he starts picking up the landmines and throwing them off to the side once again. He ends up winning a military medal for this. And this way he clears the route for the tanks to move up.
But the Canadians were losing momentum and in danger of ceding the initiative to the Germans. While the Eddies cleared buildings on the southern side of the Piazza Municipale, Brigadier Hoffmeister directed Lieutenant Colonel Thompson to bring his regiment north to the Piazza Vittoria, while the Patricias, sitting in the southwest, were to continue to act as the brigade reserve.
On the evening of the 22nd of December, Major General Vokes, who commands 1st Canadian Infantry Division, and Hoffy, the brigade commander, 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade commander, the light bulb comes on. Oh my goodness. The Germans aren't leaving. And Ortona is the Gustav line. It's not the Arieli River north of the town. Ortona must be the eastern anchor point of the Gustav line. That is why the Germans are fighting so hard within the city itself.
This revelation spurred the division to action. Vokes ordered the 1st and 3rd Brigades to advance northward along the western side of the ravine to isolate the city from the north and cut off a possible German withdrawal. All the division's assets and attachments were now committed to this fight.
On the morning of the 23rd of December, the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, they have their anti-tank guns, and their tanks demonstrate their ability to be really violent alarm clocks. Because at 5 o'clock in the morning, they start firing all kinds of tank shells and anti-tank shells at this huge rubble pile that's at the south end of Piazza Municipale, and they blow the rubble pile into the piazza.
While the Eddies continue to clear the Piazza Municipale, the Seaforths have continued to advance and clear northwest from the Piazza Vittorio, with their immediate objective being the Piazza San Francesco. But it's tough going, given German resistance and the need for Lieutenant Colonel Thompson to detach a company from the effort to maintain contact with the Eddies.
It's this day where Captain Bill Longhurst, who is the officer commanding A Company of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, makes a really smart tactical move. Now remember, we're fighting in Old Town, where all the buildings are now shoulder to shoulder. And Bill Longhurst is like, we've been going in through the doors and the windows on the main floors and fighting bottom up. We clear from bottom up, and then we come back down and we go to the next building, we do it over again. And the Germans have had the initiative the entire time because they know we're coming in through the doors and the windows on the main floor. So that's where they put the booby traps and the riflemen and the machine gun positions. But we're now in an area of Old Town where all the buildings are shoulder to shoulder. So what he does is he has his A Company soldiers take the first building at Piazza Municipale. So he calls up his engineers and his infantry pioneers, and he says, I want you to make an explosive, and we're going to put it on the wall of the top floor of this building, and we're going to blow a wall in so that we can enter the next building from the top floor. And so his engineers and pioneers rig up some simple explosives, and they lean the explosive against the wall, and they blow that wall, and then they do it again to the second wall of the building next door. And then they toss in some grenades, they fire into the hole, and then they enter the next building from the top floor. And then they start fighting downwards, so from the top down. And of course, fighting top down is a lot easier because you can throw your grenades down the stairs, you can fire down the stairs, and gravity works for you when you're fighting top down, right? So it completely shocks the Germans because they're expecting the Canadians to come in through the bottom floor now, but now the Canadians have come in from the top floor and they fight their way down. And they're able to actually clear the building a lot quicker because they've taken the initiative away from the Germans. And so they fight top down, and then they just walk back up the stairs to the top of the building, and they rig up some more explosives, and they blow another hole in, and they just go into the next building next door, and they start fighting top down again. So top down, back up to the top, clear, blow a hole, top down, back up to the top, and they keep doing this. The great thing about that is as they're doing this, the Germans on the other side of the street realize that they're now being bypassed by the Canadians on the other side of the street. So now the Germans start withdrawing on the other side of the street without the Canadians having to clear that side of the street. Of course, the Canadians will go through those buildings just to make sure. But now they're clearing both sides of the street by clearing one side of the street. Well, this whips around the brigade. Hey, do this thing called, we're creating these mouse holes where we're just, instead of going in through the doors and windows, we're making our own entrances, but going in through the top floor and down. Now, a lot of Canadians like to think that it was the Canadians at Ortona that invented this mouse holing technique, and it wasn't. It was actually something that was in British doctrine already. It was called the vertical technique. So the Seaforths started doing it too. They're like, well, it's working for the Loyal Eddies, let's start doing it over here. And, sometimes the Germans would leave Teller anti-tank mines behind, so the engineers would grab those and rig up a simple fuse and use those to blow the holes in the buildings, and they start doing this mouse holing technique. So this starts to become very effective for the Canadians.
With the Piazza Municipale now cleared, the Eddies now had to split the regiment's effort. While continuing to utilize the mouse holing technique, D Company would attack due north towards the Piazza Plebiscita. Another company would continue to attack northeast towards the Cathedral San Tommaso, while a third company would attack into the Piazza San Tommaso.
And so now you have two battalions, the Loyal Eddies and the Seaforths, now fighting two battalions, the two 2nd battalions from the 3rd and the 4th regiments, respectively. So it's a 1-to-1 fight, which is not ideal at all if you're on the attack, right? Normally you want a 3-to-1 offensive to defensive ratio. In urban operations, you even want it higher because of the amount of casualties that are incurred. Not only that, but Adolf Hitler, who at this point is starting to micromanage a lot of his commanders, has said that Ortona will be held at all costs. There will be held at all costs. There will be no giving up 1 square inch of Ortona itself. This battle now has become more violent. There are more resources being thrown in by the Canadians. There's more resources being thrown in by the Germans. The Germans are bound and determined to follow Hitler's direction to make sure that Ortona is not lost. And now the Canadians have reached the main defensive area where the Germans are bound and determined to stop the Canadians.
From the beginning, the Germans planned and prepared the northern portion of Ortona as the linchpin of its defense for the eastern side of the Gustav Line. The Canadians were now in the thick of it.
The Seaforths are able to get 8 to 10 soldiers into the school rather easily, almost too easy. And a couple of the Seaforth soldiers are like, geez, that was way too easy to do that. And they're in that building for a few minutes when suddenly there's this huge explosion and the building implodes upon itself and buries the section of Seaforths in the school. And so what happened is the Germans had actually laid demolitions charges in the school itself. They put up a very weak resistance to lure the soldiers, the Canadians, into the school. And then they withdrew from the school, and then they ignited the demolitions, which caused the building to explode and implode. A couple of the Seaforth soldiers try to run out and try to, remove the rubble because, their friends are buried underneath the rubble. But it's at that point where the Germans do something here that they have not done before within the battle, and they actually counterattack. German paratrooper doctrine never emphasized the counterattack because they don't have tanks, and usually to counterattack with just dismounted infantry is usually a waste of resources. The counterattacks usually don't work. The paratroopers never practiced that. So this is really unique. They have actually counterattacked. They've put a machine gun post in the top of the bell tower of the church. It unmasks and actually initiates the counterattack. So the Seaforths have to withdraw from the rubble pile. And now, suddenly the Seaforths are on the defense as these Germans flood out of the church and flood out of the hospital to try to run across the piazza and attack the Canadians at the south side of the piazza. At this time, the commanding officer of the Seaforths, Sid Thompson, is running around like a madman, organizing this now hasty defense to beat off this counterattack. The machine gun post up on the bell tower of the church is really being troublesome. Very fortunately, Corporal Gord Turnbull is a tank commander and with the Three Rivers Regiment, and he's able to snake his way up into Dead Horse Square. And Sid Thompson says, Corporal Turnbull, you've got to destroy that machine gun post in the bell tower of that church. And Corporal Turnbull's like, it's Christmas Eve and you want me to destroy a church bell tower? He's like, and Sid Thompson's like, do it, because that machine gun post is being too troublesome. Turnbull raises the cannon on his tank, and one shot's all it takes, and that destroys the machine gun posts, and they're able to defeat that counterattack. The day before Christmas, Captain Cameron and his quartermasters are running around south of Ortona, and they are borrowing and begging and stealing food, cutlery, plates, glassware, tablecloths, and they're setting up the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople for this scrumptious supper. They're able to get soup, roast pork, vegetables, mashed potatoes, gravy, pudding, mince pies, chocolate, nuts, and fresh fruit, and the most important thing, cigarettes and beer, and have this huge buffet meal laid on. Here's this violent urban battle going on, but Sid Thompson is like, you know what? This is important. It'll boost morale. So Sid Thompson's like, okay, we're going to suck the Seaforths back one company at a time, back to the Church of Santa Maria de Constantinople, and we'll have, for 2 hours, each company will be able to have a Christmas dinner. Soldiers are covered in dirt and grime and dust, and they walk into this church, and there's this huge meal. Well, you can imagine this, the morale of the Seaforths just skyrocketing.
It was a different kind of fighting at Ortona. I think it was a pretty savage period of fighting, fairly prolonged, and I don't know just the exact sequences. It was one of those rather odd times. It was Christmas, when people think of something else rather than war, and we did get a Christmas dinner out of that particular battle, moving units out of the line periodically for their dinner and a bottle of beer or some wine, and back into the line again. That's a bit of a contradiction, you know, peace, goodwill, and all that sort of thing, but it's one of the contradictions that war sometimes produces.
Christ the Lord.
Cloisons, faisant sauter les murs, à l'abri des rues infernales.
On this particular day, too, the 26th of December, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division Commander, Major General Vokes, visits the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade Commander, Bertram Hoffmeister, Hoffy. And he asks Hoffy, just point blank, he's like, Bert, is this worth it? Is Ortona worth it? You're taking a lot of casualties. Do you want to withdraw from the city and we'll try to force 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade to move a little quicker and isolate the city? And Hoffy is like, absolutely not. He's like, we are in this to win it. We are going to win this battle. Because Hoffy was thinking, my God, if I pull my brigade out of this fight, we've just taken all these casualties for nothing. Hoffy described it like he was seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. They're just at the northern end of the town. They're just got just a few more buildings, a few hundred more meters left. So he says to Chris Vokes, he's like, nope, absolutely not. We are not going to withdraw. We are seeing this right through to the very end. To pull out right now will just destroy the morale of my brigade. And Ortona has actually become international news by now. It's being referred to as Little Stalingrad. I mean, Stalingrad involved divisions and divisions being thrown in this humongous urban fight, whereas this is just, 2 battalions versus 2 battalions. But it's becoming Little Stalingrad because of how intense and how violent the fight is between the Canadians and the Germans. By calling it Little Stalingrad, the Germans are almost forced to hold on to it. It becomes a very symbolic meaning that, they can't lose yet another Stalingrad. The Germans, once again, demonstrating how sneaky they are. They had actually taken apart one of their anti-tank guns and had put it back together on the 2nd floor of a house and had hidden it up there. And so suddenly, they've got this beautiful view of the tank. And so they start firing rounds from that anti-tank gun, and they hit the tank, and they end up destroying it. The crew are thankfully they're only lightly wounded, but they can't withdraw from the tank. Like, they can't withdraw the tank because they still got the bit of the rubble pile behind them. The tank's been pretty much a mobility kill. It's pretty much destroyed. So they have to abandon the tank. Big Jim Stone is trying to fight his soldiers around Piazza Plebiscita, but this anti-tank gun now changes the equation. And by now, the 17-pounder anti-tank guns and the tankers have actually figured out, okay, if we hit these parts of the building, we can actually collapse the entire building on top of the Germans. So, I mean, this is how vindictive the fighting is now getting. The Germans decide that they are going to withdraw from the city, but they can't let the Canadians know that. So what they do is they decide to fool the Canadians into believing that they're actually going to stay and fight forever, as long as it takes. And so they initiate something called Operation Ortona, which is a deception plan. And they over the radio, which they know the Canadians are listening to, over the radio, they're saying, okay, yep, we're going to put more forces in. We're going to bring in close air support. We're going to destroy more of the city to stop the Canadians from advancing. And that's exactly what they do. The Germans start destroying more buildings, and they start flipping over trams and putting cars into the streets, more cars in the streets, more explosions, more artillery, more close air support coming in, just to make it look like, yeah, we're staying for sure. But in reality, they have every intention of withdrawing, because the concern is 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade. If they get up to the north end of the town from the west, they're going to completely isolate those 2 battalions in the town, and they'll be destroyed, right? And they can't afford to do that. Very early in the morning of the 27th of December, the Z-Force carry up via Montemaiella and actually get up to the Piazza Plebiscita by the end of the day, where they can afford the link up with the Loyal Edmonton Regiment soldiers who've now fought their way around and through Piazza Plebiscita itself.
This is Matthew Bolton of the CDC, speaking from Italy.
At 8 o'clock this morning, I was bumping over the tank rut into the outskirts of Ortona. There was a strange silence, and I surmised something. Bearded men who hadn't had their boots off for 30 days were laughing. The colonel grinned when I came in. I said, "Don't tell me." And he replied, "Yes, Ortona was ours."
The morning of 28th December 1943, some Italian civilians, or some Ortonesi, they suddenly seem to be appearing out of the buildings. And some of them find some soldiers from the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, and they go, yes, the Germans have left the town. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment sends Lieutenant Alan Johnson, he's their scout platoon commander, ahead up to the castle at the north end of the town, which had not been used in the battle at all. Lieutenant Johnson goes up and he runs into some Ortonesi as well, and they say to him, yes, the Germans have gone. And in a somewhat ironic statement, they go, you know, there weren't many Germans here. We don't know what took you so long. And so Lieutenant Johnson, you know, chuckled at that statement. The irony of it, you know, it took him 8 days just to get to the north end of the town. And so he's able to relay the information back to its headquarters to say that the Italian civilians had told us that the Germans have withdrawn from the town completely. And they had done it without any Canadian knowledge. So it was the evening of the 27th and the morning of the 28th. The Germans had actually very quietly withdrawn from the town, gone up the road, mounted on the vehicles, and actually withdrew up to the Riccio River without the Canadians knowing. And so this is why on the 28th of December, they discovered that the Germans have completely withdrawn from the city. And so the fighting has now ended. The Germans have all these advantages when they're fighting this urban defense, and yet they lost. And why is that? How did the Canadians win? First, good combined arms tactics. Tanks and infantry and engineers and artillery all working together as a team to put maximum violence downrange to destroy German positions. The improvisation of weapons systems and weapons platforms, using the 6-pounder and the 17-pounder anti-tank guns to destroy defensive positions, right? I mean, the Germans don't have tanks in Ortona, but like Tiger Welch said, why have them sit idle? Bring those guns up and use them to destroy the positions. The engineers started getting really creative with their explosive devices. They were using the German anti-tank teller mines to help with the mouse holing. They were using small beehive explosive charges to do the mouse holing. That mouse holing technique was certainly one of the critical reasons why the Canadians won. There is a great cost to this fight. There were over 1,300 civilians killed in this battle due to the level of violence that was being exhibited by the Canadians and the Germans. Canadians also killed Ortonesi because they didn't know that the Ortonesi were hiding in certain buildings. In the next few months, the Canadians really do redeem themselves to the Ortonesi, to Ortona civilians. The engineers are brought in, the infantry pioneers are brought in to try to find all the booby traps and to demine the town. They want to double check the structure of all the buildings. They don't want the civilians moving back into the buildings and have the buildings collapse because they've been weakened by all the artillery fire and the violence. And they also start paying the civilians for services. So when the civilians are coming back into the town, they get paid to help remove the rubble. They get paid for laundry services. They get paid for hair cutting services, tailoring the clothes. Canadians start cleaning up the polluted water wells. The Canadians start giving medical services and support to the civilians themselves. The Ortonesi start inviting Canadian soldiers in for home-cooked meals. They start inviting them in for social events, bingo nights, movie nights. And this takes weeks and weeks of cleaning up the town and making it into a rest and recreation center for all of British 8th Army. There is some looting, there is some drunkenness from soldiers drinking too much, but they bring in the military police. But over the next few weeks now, the Canadians really do redeem themselves to the Ortonesi by jump-starting the economy, by helping clean up the town, by making the town safe again, and by becoming friends with a lot of the Italian civilians that lived in the town and helping them find their loved ones and bury them, etc. It's just this wonderful post-battle story that's really not told a lot. There are a number of burial services for the number of Canadians that have been killed in action. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment suffered 109 wounded and 63 soldiers killed in action in the week of fighting at Ortona. The Seaforth Highlanders, 62 wounded and 41 killed in action in the fighting. The Three Rivers Regiment, the tank regiment, for their support not only to the 2nd Brigade inside Ortona, but the 1st and the 3rd Brigades west of the town. So they had 20 soldiers wounded in the fighting. And they actually end up burying the soldiers at what is now Morrow River Cemetery, which is just southeast of Ortona. And that's where all the soldiers from the Ortona campaign are now buried, at that Morrow River Canadian Cemetery.
Following the bitter hand-to-hand fighting at Ortona, the Sea Force of Canada put to rest their war-weary comrades. Gathered at the graveside with the chaplain, the men stand in silent tribute with the words of the lesson read by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton, echoing across the battle-scarred resting place. As the strains of the last post fade across the Adriatic, the Sea Force seal the graves of their comrades with flowers of the forest. This bit of earth in foreign soil, this resting place from strife and toil, from blood and sweat and tears, rough-hewed, well-loved, remembered always.
I see the blue Italian waters, and in my dreams I drift once more along the lazy Adriatic, beside the blue Sicilian shore. The moon lights up the Bay of Naples, the place we loved above the rest. So sing to me the songs of Italy, the songs I'll always love the best.